Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our special event this evening. It's a series of events that we do, debates, lectures, and so forth, called the Independent Policy Forum. I also want to invite our viewers who are streaming on both YouTube and ThinkSpot, who hopefully will be participating in this evening's event. We're quite delighted this evening to welcome our good friend, the renowned journalist, historian, and best-selling author, Amity Shlaes, who will be speaking based on her path-breaking new book, Great Society, A New History. For those of you new to the Independent Institute, hopefully you received a packet. You'll find information about us in the packet. We are a nonprofit, scholarly public policy research foundation. We sponsor in-depth studies of major social and economic issues and publish results as books and hold events and media projects based on that. Our mission is to boldly advance peaceful, prosperous, and free societies grounded in a commitment to human worth and dignity. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to point out that in the packets that you've received, there is a copy of an article by Amity that we placed in the San Francisco Chronicle yesterday. There's also an excellent review of her book from the Wall Street Journal. All of us really know, at least most of us hopefully, is that today a battle is raging in the US as some Americans are attracted to what they think is socialism and economic redistribution, while opponents argue for less government, freer markets, and greater choice. In the 1960s, Americans sought many of the same goals some are seeking now, which include an end to poverty, higher standards of living for the middle class, affordable housing, a better environment, and more access to healthcare and education. Sound familiar? Yet achieving these goals has proven elusive at best. Just as with the big government technocratic planning by the quote-unquote best and brightest in Vietnam, the question is whether central planning by domestic elites is responsible for guaranteeing fiascos here at home as well. What's more, have Lyndon Johnson's and Richard Nixon's welfare program shackled millions of people, especially families, in permanent government dependence and brokenness? This evening, and based on her new book, Great Society, and drawing on her economic expertise and deep historical knowledge, Amity is going to examine for us some of the costs of the so-called progressive entitlement commitments made half a century ago by blocking the very opportunities needed now and in the future for all Americans, especially the most disadvantaged. Amity Shlaes is the author of 4 #1 best-selling books, including The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Society, and Coolidge. A former member of the editorial board and columnist of the Wall Street Journal, she serves as a presidential scholar at King's College in New York. She is a recipient of both the Hayek Prize and the Frederick Bastiat Prize, and she's been a finalist for the Loeb Prize in commentary. We could spend all night talking about her accomplishments, but instead, please help me join in welcoming Amity Shlaes.
David didn't mention the New York Times review, which said the book was deeply flawed. We can talk about that. Yay. Deeply flawed. A book about great society deserves great thanks. My thanks to the Independent Institute, to David Thoreau, the Thoreaus, Graham Walker, Roland and Gidi Underhill, and many friends who brought me here. Thank you. I want to mention, because we do have a farther audience, ThinkSpot, YouTube, glad to know you and welcome you, that this institute has indeed contributed in important ways to all knowledge and to my knowledge. I'm going to mention 3 books that changed my thinking. One set of books is the work of Robert Higgs about the growth of government. And particularly his point that in wars we tend to grow government and then never shrink it after. Another author who's worked with this institution has a new book out is Rich Vedder, is an education expert, but it was his work on unemployment that helped me to write Forgotten Man. What Rich showed was that the unemployment in the 1930s in the Great Depression was very high. And he documented that in ways that weren't always, he offered data that wasn't up to then really available to the public, month-by-month unemployment data from the 1930s. I also want to mention David Beto, who's written wonderful books basically about the local and about federalism and the power of what the local can do and what the government in Washington far away cannot. These are all authors who have worked with the Independent Institute. This particular book, the first sentence of this book, this new book, asks a question: why not socialism? It's a question that all centrists, all markets people want to answer. We're here at an educating, indeed scholarly think tank tonight. Think tanks try to find answers. We want to make investments long-term in projects that open American minds to the reality of socialism. We see the merit in conducting education, as I do in my work, so younger people, when they come to vote or lead businesses and families or participate in politics, recognize what is useful policy and what is less useful policy. That would be the socialist policy. But educating long-term is very hard. Sometimes we don't have the heart for the long haul. We feel frustrated at the prospect of slow outcomes, outright failure. Politics is more fun. Twitter is more fun. YouTube is more fun. And people remember what they see that's instant. They remember politicians who work in short election cycles. They don't remember educators and dusty books, always, right? So we, the ideas people, journalists, scholars, philanthropists, business philosophers, we want to be remembered, and we want to do work that's remembered. So sometimes we'll pick short-term work over long-term work. I'm saying this in 2020, a year when short-term work is very attractive because it's an election year. So tonight I'd like to tell a story about a crazy long-term venture, a long shot. This story starts in the late 1950s. It features a company, two men, one you know and one obscure, and the American public. It's a story of humiliation, business shame, and intellectual failure. No way around it. But the story, which ends in the 80s, is also about the application of good philosophy, its tremendous effect, and unexpected success. It's a story we're here in California. Many in California already know, but might appreciate recalling given the current political environment. The name of the company was General Electric. In the 1950s, what was GE? GE was riding high. Every year, Americans bought more TVs from GE, more radios, more freezers. GE wasn't just a company. It was an icon in the United States. It served the space programs and the Tennessee Valley Authority. Americans trusted GE, it was said, just as they trusted the game of baseball. It was a good company that followed the rules where you wanted to work. The essence of America was General Electric. As you know, in 1959, the Soviets invited the United States to create a display about progress at Moscow in Sokolniki Park. The point for us was to show off that our standard of living was pretty high, maybe higher than the socialist standard of living of communist Soviet Union. And America sent not one, but several model kitchens. The lemon yellow one was the GE kitchen. Most General Electric execs at that time, like executives at most companies, had a set view about how capitalism worked, though. The private sector was invincible. It could do anything, and the private sector was supposed to serve as a kind of energy source or milk cow, say, for the public sector. The government could herd the private sector along like a domestic animal, as Keynes once said. And to many men, it was mostly men at GE at the time, that arrangement seemed just fine. The milk cow liked the government. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a big client of the GE, as I mentioned. It was the essence of a government project, and GE had a lot of revenue from Tennessee Valley Authority sales. GE executives at the top, and GE was run at the top, they were content in the service of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. Unions existed by virtue of pro-union federal laws, and they demanded big packages from GE. All right, GE would pay. Social experiments by the federal government? Well, most executives at GE thought America and GE could shoulder social projects too, whether expansion of healthcare, additional welfare, financial support of young parents, work with delinquents, you name it. Heavy demands from unions, GE could afford just about any wage at that time. Stalin, the Soviet leader, was said to have joked that the only country in the world rich enough to afford communism was the United States. I think that's what people think about socialism now. And why should this not be true? In the 1960s, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was regarded as the metric for the future of American health. If the stock market went along, then the country would go along with it, and it was approaching a record level of 1,000. Seemed only a matter of months before we would cross past the landmark and onto heaven. But there was one GE executive, an aging vice president, who saw things differently. And the name of this man, this is the obscure man, was Lemuel Ricketts Boulware. I think some people in the new room know him. Boulware believed growth didn't come when a corporate board paid taxes to the federal government or sold to the federal government, or even when it made big business plans. Boulware believed growth took place when a lonely scientist flaunting the world in his dumpy lab came up with a new idea. Maybe the light bulb invented by GE's own Thomas Edison. Boulware believed the burden of government spending and the burden of union demands, well, they were gradually sapping American vitality and competitiveness. The reason our kitchens were better than Russian kitchens, in his view, was those long-term investments in freedom in the United States and investments in ideas by people like Thomas Edison. The reason the companies thrived was that the goods were affordable, but the high wages and prices everyone was agreeing to, and taxes and payments to unions, well, that would make GE in America uncompetitive. In the end, the Russians, he didn't even dream of Asia. Let's just stick with the Russians. Or somebody else would make better kitchens than our kitchens. It was the God-given assignment of a pristine company like GE, national hero, to inspire Americans to return to the old capitalism of Edison. And the problem was urgent, this Mr. Boulware said. He said, I'm going to read a sentence from him. The current rapid trend has got to be changed, or we are through with everything we cherish. Boulware. Well, the younger executives at GE, the madmen with the nice suits, they found this Boulware ridiculous. Boulware wasn't modern. His drama irritated them. In the public, many also agreed. Fortune magazine described Mr. Boulware as a figure who combined the folksiness of a Kentucky farm background with the fervor of a washing machine salesman. The other executives told themselves they didn't have to worry. Mr. Boulware was approaching retirement. By 1960 or 1965, he would be out anyhow with all his rhetoric. Let him rant from his recliner chair in Delray Beach. Still, Mr. Boulware wasn't finished. He determined to use his final years and hours at GE to make his own long-term investment in the future, GE's and America's. He wanted to teach Americans about the gift of capitalism. He spent millions in GE funds printing out little pamphlets explaining about markets and supply and demand and bureaucracy and the cost of bureaucracy. He warned towns where GE operated, the Midwest or the East or the West, that the high wages They were forced to pay. The companies would force the companies eventually to leave. One town was Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and Boulware had a pamphlet that read, "Grass will grow in Pittsfield," if Pittsfield didn't wake up to the problem of uncompetitive prices and wages. He used a new media, in that case, TV and radio, to reach people, and he created a show called GE Theater to showcase American values. He hired staff, and this is the part everyone here knows, including an aging actor to be GE spokesman, and the actor was a rock-ribbed Democrat, actually, a union man. Kind of admired Franklin Roosevelt, but Boulware thought the actor had potential. So he kitted out a special GE house with all modern appliances, kind of like the GE kitchen in Moscow, for the actor to live in with his new wife and his children. And he schooled the actor in Adam Smith and Friedrich von Hayek and John Locke and Alexis de Tocqueville. And he gave him little books by Henry Hazlitt, which I also recommend. Economics in One Lesson, still a good one to read. Well, the actor wasn't exactly popular all across GE either. The younger executives didn't like this propagandist. They didn't like Boulware, and they complained. But for the few remaining years Boulware had, the youngsters couldn't stop Boulware or the actor. Boulware sent the actor to hundreds of GE plants to give speeches to all the workers so the workers could understand what would happen. The actor also slowly internalized the lessons. He wrote speeches about the dangers of socialism. Socializing medicine was a bad idea. Well, he also learned that from his new father-in-law, right? The Tennessee Valley Authority was a bad idea. Power might innovate faster when government wasn't making the rules. You know, making the choice between hydropower, nuclear power, then newer coal or right? And soon enough, the actor became a convert. He even bought his son some stock in GE. But the years 1960 and 61 cast a dark cloud over GE, Boulware's propaganda mill, the whole company, including the actor. The Justice Department started to investigate the company. The new Attorney General, whose name was Robert Kennedy, pulled together a strong case that GE was colluding with other companies like Westinghouse to fix high prices for the products they sold to the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Justice Department went to court, and the judge sent GE executives to jail. The irony of it all was close to unbearable. Here was GE's propaganda department mouthing off about free markets, even as GE cheated the American taxpayer. This antitrust case was a terrible blow for GE. The company looked like the worst hypocrite in the world. People felt betrayed by the trusted company. When they talked about baseball and GE now, it was the Black Sox Scandal of 1919 they referred to. That was what kind of situation GE was in. A national betrayal. GE stock went in the toilet. The actor was fired. GE Theater was canceled. Mr. Boulware got pneumonia. I learned that because I went to look at his archive. And he recovered, but he did retire to Delray Beach. The years that followed, Boulware's retirement years, are the topic tonight, the Great Society, which only deepened, doubtless, the sense of failure for him. GE, first of all, deepened its cooperation with and service to government. And the news about the country on Boulware's TV set mocked all his old speeches. American voters didn't turn away from social democracy or socialism, whatever you want to call it. They voted for it. They voted for, and very strongly, Lyndon Johnson after the tragic death of President Kennedy. And they voted for Johnson's socializing program, the Great Society. They made it strong. What was that program? President Lyndon Johnson promised to cure, note the verb, C-U-R-E, cure poverty, and make America more than just a good place. It was called not good society, but great society, a great place with an even greater economy, and to do that through the government. He created, President Johnson, a poverty office, the Office of Economic Opportunity, with a poverty czar. He promised and created programs in all areas. He said countryside, classroom, cities. And Johnson, as many other books I've shown, had a real affection and ability. He was a real master of laws. Joe Califano, who worked for him, said Johnson made laws the way other men ate chocolate chip cookies. So you want to imagine this great society, a whole room of laws, a raft of laws. Johnson was only the beginning. One of the revisions in my book, that is, if you revise history and point out some new angle, is Richard Nixon. In my research, I discovered that Richard Nixon actually expanded the federal government farther than President Johnson. John Cogan of Hoover has done a nice book about this too, which I highly recommend, The High Cost of Good Intentions. The numbers which were laid out at the time and then later are kind of stupendous. By 1980, if you look at all the programs that followed in the spirit of the Great Society, health and medical costs were 6 times the 1950 levels after, even in real dollars. Public assistance by 1980 was 13 times the 1950 level, even adjusted for inflation. Social insurance was 27 times the 1950 commitment, and no, the population did not grow that much, nor did GDP, by the way, and housing costs, and we're talking here including public sector, were 129 times 1950 costs. And what was the result? The Great Society did fail. The government expansion did not cure poverty. In fact, and in the book I have a lot of charts because I like to have data when I make allegations. The drop in poverty was dropping pretty fast before the Great Society. Around the time of the Great Society, it began to slow down, and then it leveled off and flattened at 10%. The poverty programs in particular and the social welfare programs did shackle many Americans into dependence. Generally speaking, there was a terrible morning after effect that followed the Great Society binge. The U.S. economy began to flail. The milk cow got sick as never before. The high costs of labor did drive business out of towns. Grass did grow in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, as Mr. Boulware had predicted. The great thriving center of Detroit, the heart of the United States, became the Rust Belt. The Dow Jones Industrial Average went, averages are also people. They make decisions, right? The Dow Jones Industrial Average decided it didn't want to cross 1,000. It decided that over and over again. So the Dow never reached that 1,000 mark until the 80s. So you want to imagine now losing a decade, and losing a decade, and that's before inflation, right? Losing a decade of your life, and nowadays when we do think an ever-rising stock market is our birthright. In the book, I show that the Great Society wasn't socialist like Moscow, but it was socialist in that American idealistic way we're talking about now, and it was just socialist enough to do that damage. Why does socialism do damage? That one thing the Independent Institute is good at explaining is that. And the reason is not just that people hate collectives. There's another reason. It's that socialism usually comes from far away, from Washington. And usually, when it comes to running things, the local place does a little better because they know when the school needs a gym or a French teacher or a Spanish teacher. And what Washington sends might be just the absolute wrong thing that town doesn't need. Big government, redistributing government, often makes errors about the needs of individuals. And the whole while, you can imagine Boulware, who lived decades, beating himself up about the failure of his conversion effort, right? One figure was truly converted, however. He did care. That was the actor whose name you know, Ronald Reagan. And thinking about it all, Reagan decided to take a try at politics. His motto was very interesting. He didn't want a great society. He wanted a creative society. That's what he settled on when he began in politics. Like Thomas Edison. In '64, he took his standard GE speech and gave it on television, practically word for word. America had to choose socialism or no. That was what became known as the time for choosing speech. Then the actor ran for governor in the state of California, where he gave the speech over and over again and put the policies of GE and Boulware into practice: government restraint, trying to save money, balancing the budget, fighting expansion of welfare, Medi-Cal, Medicare. These were tough battles. One hilarious one involved the Poverty Office. The Poverty Office had a big program for public interest lawyers. It paid for public interest lawyers. I think Mr. Barber is here. I mean, there's one fellow or two here who were involved in this. So from Washington would come money for public interest lawyers. That sounds nice, except the public interest lawyers would sue who? They would sue the governor of California, right? To change something. Reagan balances the budget. He gets sued by these government-paid lawyers who want to make him spend more, unbalancing the budget, making him fail in his constitutional obligation to the state of California. This bugged Reagan. He just thought he might veto. Governors had the right to veto a federal project from the Poverty Office. But another rule of the Poverty Office was that the Poverty Office could veto the government's veto, could overrule, right? Washington always wins. So there came a long discussion, this was by the time of Richard Nixon, between President Richard Nixon's office and Governor Reagan, and these were two powerful men, and Nixon was well aware of the impact of Reagan and his as a political threat. And Reagan said, I'm going to veto, and if you overrule my veto, the whole nation will know that Nixon was less free market than Reagan. So they had a meeting, and Nixon sent an emissary, and that emissary was Frank Carlucci, who later became very famous in other work. Governor Reagan's representative was Ed Meese. And the two of them are in something like a hotel room, like a room like this, and the government men say, maybe a government lawyer, Mr. Carlucci has this in his memoir of the period. You can be a stinker and you can veto our federal program and then we'll have to overrule you. That's the A movie. Imagine you're making movies. That's the A movie. That's a scenario you can follow. Or you can do the B movie. The B movie is we kind of agree and we, the federal government, figure out something we can do for you, Ronald Reagan, just so you don't cause us to lose face by vetoing our program. And Mr. Meese went into the other room and telephoned Governor Reagan, came back, said, we'll take the B movie. Carlucci remembers that. Anyway, Reagan did get something out of it, which is support for his innovative welfare reduction program. Reagan essentially said this morning after effect of the 70s has to end. It was time for morning in America, not morning after in America. And the entire counter-revolution that Reagan brought that morning in America came whence? It came out of the little pamphlets, the classes and speeches that old Lem Boulware had so lovingly prepared with his mimeograph machine, right? Boulware's long-term investment, his crazy philosophical thing that didn't get any new voters, at least not right away, and not necessarily party political, had in the end paid off in a magnitude that is near unimaginable. Both parties benefited from Lem Boulware. Bill Clinton signed a welfare reform that could have been written by Lem Boulware. Markets thrived, an era commenced in which we did come to feel that an ever-rising stock market is our birthright, and you know where the stock market is today. I'm going to conclude with just a couple lessons from the Great Society, my book, and the period. What I concluded is that the public sector is rotten at planning, especially the faraway public sector, no matter how much it spends in people's money. A second point is that intellectual, thoughtful, bookish projects that seem like a complete failure in the short or medium term may turn out not to be a complete failure. Sometimes a project is just early, and sometimes that earliness is good. Think of it from the point of view of the voters who learned about markets from GE, including many union members. Some of those meetings had an effect. Those voters understood what Reagan, the actor, was saying, and that there was another way for the American worker. And the same voters, and from both parties, emerged as Reagan's famous silent majority blue-collar vote of 1980. More obvious, the Great Society offers a lesson on trusting your own judgment. If you think of the institutions that inspired you as a child or a young adult, and you turn off the TV and you start to read about the past or a different place and write about it, then you can build your own institution, which may not even succeed before you're dead. Okay, it may not. But that does not mean it won't succeed ever, because you'll be planting a seed. Independent Institute, does that. You'll be planting a seed that will bear fruit later. It really has that potential. That's what I try to do with the Coolidge Foundation, anyhow, where I work. A theoretical seed can be a most fruitful seed. Final point, and David actually said this, individuals matter. Without Boulware and without Reagan, this story might not have happened. And finally, I will say, if you think your name will not be remembered for doing obscure policy work or supporting it, you may be wrong. I'm standing right here in early 2020, on the beginning of 2020, here with you 3 decades after the death of the obscure GE executive. And everyone in this room is thinking kindly about President Reagan and his policy work, but we're also raising a theoretical glass to the name of Lemuel Ricketts Boulware. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amity. One thing I might add, which I'm sure Amity knows, is Boulware wrote a book, and the title of it is The Truth About Boulwarism, and the subtitle is Trying to Do Right Voluntarily. Also, many of you may have been to Disneyland years ago, and they had Disney created something called the Carousel of Progress. It was the GE Carousel of Progress. So we're open to questions from the audience.
Hello. I mean, the history that you recounted is very important and all, but let's talk about today. What I find really interesting is to answer that question about is socialism good or bad, or why doesn't it work? But we can look at 2, quote, socialist communist countries, mainland China and Vietnam, and they have lifted millions of people out of poverty by working very hard in a capitalist fashion, whereas we can see countries like Venezuela and Greece, they went down the socialist route, and they're either starving or trying not to. Could you speak on that?
Well, I think the examples speak for themselves. One of the good things to do with young people is to travel them, take them around. So, yeah.
Question right here.
Thank you, though.
Yeah, perhaps one reason I'm here is that I was in the war on poverty back in the 60s. I was a soldier, you could say, in Vista, which went to Alabama for legal services and Head Start and all these different programs. I wonder, I haven't read your book yet, but I wonder if you could address the enormous inefficiencies and even the corruption in these government programs, which I saw firsthand and which really depressed me for years.
Oh, well, you know more about this than I. Let's talk about what was good and genuine about the 60s. The people in the South, the black people, were often not allowed to vote. So you have a state like Mississippi where 10% of the blacks are registered to vote. That's a wrong. Who can rectify it? They can themselves, but they need support from within their state or outside. So in the book, I give a favorable portrait to those students who went down to help people get the vote in the South. that movement was a bit eclipsed by the Great Society, in fact. The Great Society was the official government response. It wasn't young idealistic people who really want to help with a genuine problem. It was officials who started to come. And one of the interesting stories about Head Start is that I'm trying to think, it was Casey Hayden, a friend of hers. They said, we were doing things with this community, and then Head Start came and kind of crowded us out. And said, so when a foreign office comes into your town and dumps a lot of money, a cascade, a flood of money, it sort of takes away the genuineness of anything that's going on before. So that's one thing about Head Start. I always had, thinking over the years about Head Start, what could be wrong with a nursery school program? What is wrong with these conservatives? They're complaining about Head Start. How can they hate a nursery school program? But I figured out where the hostility to Head Start came from. In America, historically, who has been in charge of schools? Towns. Maybe the state, but towns. And there's a lot of good in that because the town knows, usually, though not always, what the town needs. What Head Start was a federal program so righteous, it was whatever metaphor you choose to use, the camel's nose in the tent, for a federal role in all of K through 12 or pre-K through 12 education. And it really was because there were a number of education laws that followed that brought federal intervention into schools and then universities. So I think that's the corruption. It wasn't exactly always illegal corruption, but it was corruption nonetheless. It was taking away the freedom of a local community. Tocqueville was murdered multiple times in the 1960s, wasn't he, by these programs? I think my next book is going to be about Tocqueville. So that is the principle that an American town knows what it's doing. He wrote that the municipal government was a fragile thing, almost like a consumptive patient, because the county could roll over it, the state could roll over it, and in our era, the federal government could roll over it. But it's still precious, a municipal government, because it knows what's going on and therefore can guess a little better what to deliver with tax revenues. Is that? Yeah.
Let me just interject. We have some questions from ThinkSpot viewers. There's one from Ted. He says, many believe the targeting of black families under the Great Society was intentionally malicious. Is there evidence to support this? And further, is it even a good idea to pursue such a line of investigation? Is it enough to demonstrate a cynical attitude towards gaining the black vote and at least a lack of consideration for the actual measurable consequences?
No, I don't believe that it wasn't targeting. It was kind-hearted support, right? Kind-hearted support from the federal government for poor people, a number of whom were black, was what was offered. The result you can understand Ted's question, because the result was so sad that you would think that whoever perpetrated this was malicious. That is to say, we taught families, white and black, that they would always receive something and that it was their property. One of the cases I look at in the book, and I've discussed this with Judge Janice Rogers Brown, is a case called Goldberg v. Kelly, which was the case that said rich people have property, they have patents, and they might have houses. Middle-class people have property, they have patents and houses. Poor people should consider welfare payments their property. That was basically the case. It involved due process. It was in New York. And this was the hardening of the concept of property entitlement, right? It was hardened in the 60s. And, you know, the Yale law professor Charles Reich had written a striking paper about this. His old boss, the Justice Hugo Black, thought it was kind of weird Because when you make an entitlement the property of one person, you're taking away the property of another person to pay for that entitlement, aren't you? And if you do that on a mass basis, well, you're doing more expropriating than you are doing giving, right? Giving people property. But that was a terrible problem, and it visited upon communities with problems, including especially blacks.
So there are two socialist thinkers, Piven and Cloward, and they had an insight that bears on what you've just been talking about in an answer to Ted's question. They say that the Democrats looked at the vote in the late Eisenhower years and Nixon, and late Eisenhower years, and they saw they were losing the black vote. So how to buy off the potential people that could help organize the black vote? If they gave money to governors, well, there were too many Republican governors, Nelson Rockefeller and so forth. If they gave money to cities, there were too many cities that were run by Irish or East European white machines. The blacks would not end up with enough. So they had to have federal programs that could go into these heavily black concentrated areas, like mobilization for youth, like poverty offices, and so forth. So it's possible, and one doesn't have to agree with Piven and Cloward, but it's possible that some rather cynical thinking did go into the Great Society.
Well, in all politics, there's the seeking of constituencies. And that this is the forgotten. I mean, I could have called this book Silent Majority, but that phrase has a lot of different meanings associated with President Nixon, because when you recognize one group, you always heard another group, the forgotten men, and many of those forgotten people were black. So if you, there's some very compelling stories of the mayors in this book, and I grew up in Chicago, and I will tell you, heard a favorable word about Richard J. Daley, the boss there. Not one word my entire childhood. So on the South Side, but I got a little appreciation for him watching him in this, because Mayor Daley got the vote out for the Democrats from his point of view. He elected Kennedy with difficulty, maybe, right? He certainly elected Johnson in '64. And he had a poverty office. He had plans to help poor people because he heard Washington was interested in poverty. So Daley sent all his poverty ideas, once Johnson was safely elected, in a big box to Washington. Here's my poverty ideas. You send me the money. That's not what happened. No. The federal government, through, say, Sergeant Shriver, the poverty czar, and others, created their own offices. And those offices went to Daley's offices and made trouble. And Daley just about couldn't believe it, right? He called President Johnson and said, does the president know he's sending money to people who want to cause trouble in Chicago? And it is true that much of what, say, the Blackstone Rangers, who were indirectly funded by the federal government and the poverty program did, was counterproductive. One thing we did was support vigilantism in this way, because we bought out gangs to make them peaceful through the federal funds. That's what they do in places like Colombia. In the drug wars, it's not a great idea anywhere. Sometimes it's a last resort. But the idea was to pacify the gangs and get their buy-in so they would not riot. That I consider deeply cynical. So,
I have one comment and one question. My comment is that your book, The Greedy Hand, is something I highly recommend, especially that part about how Franklin Roosevelt, as president, couldn't figure out how to complete his income tax form. I think he sent in $15,000 to the IRS commissioner and said, I hope this is enough. My question is, in your Great Society book, you spend quite a bit of time talking about gold. Do you think that Franklin Roosevelt was really wrong when he outlawed the possession of gold? Because it seems that one of the legacies of Keynesian economics is persistent inflation, which continues to this day. What do you think?
That's a good question. Thank you for remembering about FDR and the tax form. And a lot of us sympathize with that because this is the middle of January and some people do have to send in some taxes on this week, right? The quarterly, the purgatory living quarterly filers in the room. So, okay, gold. Gold is a divisive topic, and I didn't expect to have it in the book because I didn't want to fight that particular fight with this book. There are enough controversial things in the Great Society book already. However, what I realized was gold was important to Americans. Why? Because it was a metric for them. Even after FDR had outlawed gold, people liked to know how much gold the government had. And one tendency, the story of the denial of what we were doing in the 1960s was that every time the government got a number that made it look bad, it abolished that metric. So the number would not be visible. And that was true. And then it also created metrics it needed to make its argument, such as the poverty measure, which had not existed before the 1960s. As Martin Luther King said, we didn't know we were poor until you told us, right? So with the gold, the U.S. was supposed to have a certain amount. That number was, what, 10 billion in gold. And the foreign governments who looked at us with a sage eye and saw that we were spending more than we could afford began to, with what they could do, which is withdraw the gold. And that embarrassed the administration. So eventually, we shut down the gold standard. That's the end of the book, the remains of it, when Nixon closed the gold window in August 1971, because he was embarrassed that he was running out. So I like gold because it isn't government money, and I think today it's much more comprehensible to younger people because in some regards it's like the Bitcoin. It's a measure of distrust in the sovereign government, and some people think a commodity like gold is a lot better than the Bitcoin, and some think the other way. Anyway, you can argue about that. But what is clear was that gold was important to American people, and it told a story the Great Society didn't want to be told, and neither did President Nixon, so they got rid of it, and inflation ensued. I'll add one last thing, because we have a nation of viewers here. What did it mean, inflation in the 70s? It meant your parents, when they bought a house, had to buy a house that had 2 fewer bedrooms than they would otherwise buy. You go back and look at those houses, and they were beginning to tell themselves 1,500 square feet was the limit for a house, and we all had to shrink because the interest rates were so high to combat the inflation that people couldn't afford a smaller house, and sometimes they couldn't even afford, a big house. They had to buy a smaller house, and sometimes they couldn't buy any house at all. Along with that was 10% unemployment by the end, early 80s. So it was a terrible time, the 70s, and that resulted from our monetary behavior. The final I want to thank the New York Times because it excerpted the final chapter of this book, which is the monetary chapter.
I'm very interested in the conflict that you related between Governor Reagan and President Nixon on the subject of Reagan's desire to veto the a huge poverty law, rural poverty law program in California. I'm interested in it because I worked myself for the California State Office of Economic Opportunity, and I wrote myself most of the case for Reagan supporting that. And yes, and the story that came out of it, really getting close to it, revealed incredible, heartbreaking corruption in the way they used the law in 2 different ways that interested me. One was that the poverty lawyers were never really fundamentally interested in representing the actual poor and what their problems. They were interested in an abstract psychological concept of poor people who were fighting the government and demanding more and more, and they were only interested in large class action suits that represented those people. The other part of it that really interested me a lot more, actually, is that the government then, when it had those poverty lawyers and was supporting them, I had a lot of meetings with black lawyers, indigenous lawyers. One of them was Howard Moore, Angela Davis's lawyer, which I wrote about in my book, Beyond Left and Right. And what was happening was that the federal government was basically paying radical middle-class white poverty lawyers to take clients away from the indigenous black bar, and who had to charge for their so it basically fractured the entire community, for the leaders to the followers. And it turned Howard Moore, who couldn't believe what my solution to it was, to basically convert it all into a voucher kind of program and support the clients rather than the lawyers. He looked at me and he said, "You're representing Governor Reagan here, and you want to give us power back to and allow our communities to function the way other communities, normal communities, function?" And I said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I want." And Howard Moore, this radical communist, simply flipped a switch and sounded like the Heritage Foundation or the most extreme, and just started railing against the poverty lawyers who were destroying their communities. Of course, the sad part of it was that the black lawyers could have, through the American Bar Association, demanded the Democratic Party stop this, but they were too frightened and they were too tied to the Democratic Party, because the Republicans there was no place for them to go on the Republican side. And this remains a very deep problem in our politics, I think.
Did you want Amity to comment on that?
I think it's a beautiful and tragic story. In the book, where I get at that is the 1964 convention, where there was a black delegation from, must have been Mississippi, right? The famous one. That was kind of shut out by the official Democrats. And that there's a character in the book named Robert Parris Moses, who I think is very interesting, and as far as I know is still with us, who was so disillusioned that he kind of stopped talking to everyone, but eventually developed something called the Algebra Project. His solution to trouble was that everyone should learn algebra, which I kind of agree with. Because if you are good enough at arithmetic to get up to pre-calculus, you probably will get a job. That was his solution to the injustices of the world, and that won a MacArthur grant. It's a wonderful idea. So there are a number of black characters and other characters in my book who have epiphanies like your friend, Mr. Moore.
Here's another question from one of the viewers at ThinkSpot, JBPF. The question is there any welfare model used in another country that you think is successful? If so, which one?
Well, I just say welfare works in small countries that are like small communities, right? If everyone's the same, and they all agree on everything, and they all want the same thing, then welfare can appear to work well. But in a big country like ours, the central government just can't know what's going on locally.
Hi. What are some of the, do you have any interesting, kind of data metrics about unintended consequences of anti-poverty spending, where, money has been allocated for a certain thing and has actually kind of achieved the opposite, or
I'm trying to think. Regarding the Great Society, nothing comes to mind, but I am thinking. I did make a chart with the aid in this case of John Cogan and maybe former Fed Chairman, the Office of former Fed Chairman Greenspan. We looked at Great Society spending versus New Deal spending. That is, the costs of programs that originated in the New Deal in the 1930s under Roosevelt versus the cost of Great Society programs, which originated either mainly under President Johnson, but perhaps also under President Nixon. And what the big surprise there was, that Great Society commitments cost more than New Deal commitments, and have now for a whole generation. So that was one. And another great surprise in the charts in the back, we always talk about guns and butter, and you hear on TV defense spending costs a lot. When did defense spending start to cost less than domestic spending? As early as 1971. And we have that chart in here too.
I'll interject another think spot question. What is the proper balance between government and private programs designed to assist the poor? And since you mentioned the work of David Beto, how would you relate that to it?
Again, local, more voucher-like, the better, smaller more, and less government assistance probably.
Okay.
Yeah, there are a couple books about it. I mean, it's sad, it's tragic. It partly had to do with the fact that Ralph Cordner, who is, this gentleman knows about GE, right? Ralph Cordner, who was the head of GE at the time, had this kind of Yugoslavia model, which was, that is, he wanted individual autonomous departments to make their own way and maybe be more like Thomas Edison and come up with ideas and be less centralized and not have more of a line concept of departments and less of a staff concept. So autonomous departments were responsible for their inventions and their revenues. That's a good idea, but what that meant was he kind of looked the other way, or when it came to business practices of GE salesmen who then met in rooms or bars or whatever with a salesman from other companies and agreed on a price that they were going to charge, say, Tennessee Valley Authority. The union leaders thought this was hilarious. And one union leader, I believe the electricians union, sent a GE executive in jail, a jailbird, the board game Monopoly, because he might have some time on his hands.
Another think spot question from M. Constas 2. Whilst I tend to agree with what I understand of your thesis regarding good intentions gone bad, I can't help but be skeptical that anything will be done about it. What do you propose is the best way forward now, given the historical lessons you have outlined?
Well, unfortunately, the best way is usually some kind of great economic crisis where everyone comes to his senses, but we don't wish for that. I do think the emphasis on community is something we ought to support and not consider. Community government is really interesting. Most of the socialists just look past towns and governments right to Washington. So the more we can encourage them to work locally without federal support or support of a national entity, the more they'll see the merits of the community. That's a very squishy answer, but I'm sorry.
Are you optimistic at all?
I'm always optimistic, especially.
Do you have any evidence for optimism?
Oh, yeah, totally. I have the great honor to be chairman of the Coolidge Foundation, and our goal is to educate young people about President Calvin Coolidge, who said, I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me if I get it slightly wrong, but he said, the United States are inviolate only insofar as the United States insists that Arizona is inviolate. That is, he was a ruthless federalist, Coolidge, and we have a program for young people, the Coolidge Scholarship, and then we have another larger program. So we have hundreds of kids who learn about Coolidge, and again, it's not about what party they're for, it's just that they consider ideas they might not get in school and learn there's another way to run a country than very actively and calling for greatness. And they all, they have a lot of hope and a lot of ideas, and they're very energetic, and I think young people have a lot of common sense. So I respect that, as long as we allow them to see ideas and to take in ideas.
So I just have, I guess, a proposition. So my impression is that maybe your idea of needing to have small government, the power in smaller governments is fine, and that's a good place to potentially start. But I would argue it maybe needs to go down one level below that to the family unit. And I think that for me, if you don't have a strong family unit, it doesn't matter whether you give it money or not. If it doesn't function well, if you have single parents and things. I think that's the fundamental problem, and I'm not wondering if you have any ideas how we can start even at that level instead of only at the local politician type level.
Well, I believe in the family, but I also believe the federal government can't do much about it. That has to come from us. So it has to fix itself, or, you know, there's a guy named Ian Rowe in New York who talks a lot about the importance of family because he runs a few charter schools, and he says, well, it has to come from them. It has to come from them, but welfare programs that discourage the family or that fund families so they don't need to stay together are perverse. As are many other programs that discourage the family. People who have a family are like people with insulation. They go around and nothing really hurts them. People with no family, every little poke pains them. You see it every day. So we can only wish that more Americans can find families or build them.
Amity, I'm having a problem, a reality problem here. I work in healthcare. And healthcare is 2/3 supported by the federal government. All the regulations are federal, almost all of them. It's becoming more federalized all the time. The dollars keep going up. And I'm not sure how to reverse that or how that could possibly come back to local communities.
I don't know the answer to that. That's one of the hard ones. Usually the answer in more socialized places is there's a shortage. And that is a competitor, right? There's a shortage. And that's the sad answer. So you have socialized medicine, but there is no kidney when you need one.
Someone just read Sally Pipe's work?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say John Goodman, Sally Pipes, and there are others that are on the front line critiquing not just single payer, but government pervasive involvement in healthcare.
Has anyone ever charted what the result was from Head Start as far as the children bringing more knowledge and economic advantages to communities? All the billions of dollars, I've never seen one single chart that proved anything.
Well, Head Start is a explosive topic, but so I don't want to talk about that. I'm sorry.
Okay, since we're on the topic of health, this will be the last question. This is also from someone from ThinkSpot, Jeremy Zimmerman. I worked in a public healthcare safety net hospital in California for a year and a half. Administrators regularly presented in the county's Board of Supervisors with requests for funding. New MRI machines, more nurses, more funding to care for jail inmates. The rationale was that it was less expensive to care for these populations out of the public coffers than to pay private companies to render the care. Care we were court-ordered to provide. What is your take on this reasoning?
Well, you can't through the law get a good economy, right? You have to get a good economy from the economy. So what happens in a situation like that is they run out of MRIs, right? So MRIs are nominally cheaper when you purchase them from the government, but they're not available. So it's just
nobody knows what the prices are.
Nobody knows what they're priceless things are dangerous. So, okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to especially thank Amity Shlaes, who, in my opinion, is a diamond. Oh, she exemplifies. She exemplifies, in our opinion, what excellent work in history and journalism and public discourse should be like. So I want to thank her again for her work. And for those of you who are not aware, she's actually doing a series of books on 20th century American history, which are creating a whole new paradigm for people to break through a narrative that's really been crippling society, especially the most disadvantaged. And we're particularly grateful for all of you for coming and making it so successful. So let's applaud you. Copies of Amity's books are here, and we have them at a 38% discount, which you're not going to find anywhere. I'm sure she'd be happy to sign copies. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and drive carefully, and thank you. Good night.